The 2021 NBA offseason had no shortage of interesting moves. With no huge free agents on the market and a clear top 3 in the draft, there were a ton of other moves to be made across the league. And now that we're about halfway through the 21-22 season, I wanted to take a second look at the 2021 offseason and regrade the offseason of every NBA team. We begin with the worst offseason in the entire league from this past summer, and it's the LA Lakers. And there's really two different sections of the offseason to grade when you're looking at the Lakers. One is the free agency, and the other is the Russell Westbrook trade. I was relatively optimistic about some of the free agents that they were bringing in. I thought Carmelo Anthony would help. I thought Malik Monk could help. Kendrick Nunn, but I did not like the Russell Westbrook trade at all. Immediately in the moment, I was completely down on the Russ trade. And although some of the free agents have helped, especially from a spacing standpoint, I think the Russ trade is so disastrous in terms of who they gave up, in terms of who they got back, and the opportunity cost of not having someone like Buddy Hield on the roster, that this is, for me, an F of an offseason for the LA Lakers. We move on now to the New York Knicks, a team that spent a ton in free agency after a surprise playoff run, and unfortunately, almost none of the moves that they made this offseason have worked out for them. They made some decent selections in the draft, guys that might help them in the long term moving forward, but in terms of the guys that they wanted to help them try and make another run at the postseason this year, none of them have really been overly positive when you consider how much money they spent to bring them in. Fournier has been fine. Randall has been fine, but not all NBA caliber. That's what they signed him to be. Kemba has been decent. Rose is now hurt. And I think when you look at the offseason as a whole, in terms of the money they spent and the value they're getting in return for all these players, I think this is a D offseason for the New York Knicks. We move on now to the New Orleans Pelicans, a team that I would not have expected to rank ahead of the New York Knicks in terms of their offseason at the time that it happened, because I hated the Pelicans offseason at the time. However, there have been some redeeming qualities to it. They have a potential steal in the draft in Herb Jones, someone that everybody seems to like. Murphy, the player that they picked earlier in the first round, it's going to take him a little bit of time still to grow and develop in the league. The trade they made with Memphis, in which they swapped big men, they got Jonas Valanciunas, they moved around in the draft. JV's been really, really good for them. He's been exactly what he's been on pretty much every NBA team that he's been on. He's been a really good rebounder, someone that punishes smaller lineups and really attacks the offensive glass. And statistically, he's been really good. The biggest issue for me continues to be the value they got in exchange for Lonzo Ball. Devontae Graham has been fine, but nothing special. He's not a very efficient shot maker at all. And unless he's making 3, 4, 5 threes a game, it's just not going to be a hugely positive impact on the team. And when you think about what Lonzo could have brought to this roster or to a different team in a trade down the road, I continue to go back to that as a huge, massive mistake. And so they're going to get a C- from me. Next up, the Charlotte Hornets, a team that, quite frankly, I'm disappointed by the young guys that they brought in this offseason. Bouknight has made basically no impact. Jones has made basically no impact. And I understand that this is it's a pretty deep team, especially in the backcourt, on the perimeter. But when they drafted Bouknight, a guy that was kind of a darling in that draft process, I thought that they would find him some minutes, or he would kind of force his way onto the floor at certain points. And that just hasn't been the case. They did make a move for Plumlee to try and fill that 5 spot a little bit. He's been fine. And then the one really good piece that they added is Kelly Oubre. Has been pretty good for it. But the disappointment that I feel about the rookies, and maybe in the long term they'll be really good, but as of this moment, I'm also going to give the Hornets a C-. Next up, the Dallas Mavericks, who really, their two big moves in the offseason were re-signing Tim Hardaway Jr. and then bringing in Reggie Bullock in free agency. I had some hope that the Bullock addition would really unlock some things lineup-wise for Dallas. They can kind of do some extra things defensively. He allows them another wing defender that can maybe even potentially move up a couple of spots in the lineup. He just hasn't been very good. He hasn't been shooting the basketball very well. Tim Hardaway Jr. has been good, but I'm just disappointed by the overall lack of moves, a lack of a roster shakeup, especially when you bring in a new coach. And even though they're playing better lately, I'm going to give Dallas a C-. Next up, the Sacramento Kings. Two big moves they made. They re-signed Richaun Holmes, a deal that I didn't like, but he's actually been really, really good, statistically, certainly. And then they drafted Davion Mitchell in the top 10, a player that looked really good in Summer League, looked really good initially, and defensively, he's fantastic. Like, I don't think anybody can question the defensive ability and the quickness of Davion Mitchell. But offensively, he's been a borderline disaster. He can't make a shot. He can't get the rim. He's too small. Those are huge, huge concerns for me. And I know that Sacramento is a team that has a ton of guards moving forward. They've got Fox, they've got Hield, they've got Halliburton, but you just always want to get good value out of top 10 picks. And so for me, the lack of value there for Sacramento puts them also in the C- category. We move on now out of the C- category as we go up a little bit to the San Antonio Spurs. They drafted Josh Primo 12th in the draft. He's interesting, but not someone that's having a huge impact on the season. He's the youngest player in the draft. I don't think anyone expected him to do a ton initially, but that certainly was seen as a bit of a reach at the time, and that's kind of played itself out so far. They brought in Doug McDermott, who's been pretty good for them, and they added a future first in the DeMar DeRozan trade, which I think is pretty good value. I know DeMar's been awesome for Chicago, but the market for him at the time was not nearly what it would be now, and so to get a first in exchange for him, I like that. I'm going to give them a C overall because I think they could have done better in the draft. As of this moment, in the long term, maybe Primo ends up being really good, but I'm going to give the Spurs a C. Next up, the Portland Trailblazers. Not a ton of moves here. They really didn't do all that much, which is my biggest disappointment. I felt like this was a roster that was in need of a shakeup. They traded for Larry Nance. They re-signed Norman Powell, who's been really good statistically, but it's just a real lack of activity that's disappointing for me. I'm going to just put Portland down as a C. We move on now to the Philadelphia 76ers, another team that just didn't do a ton. They brought in Andre Drummond, who's been fine. George Niang has been fine, but it's just a lack of activity, especially with all the Simmons stuff going on. I'm going to give them a C simply for a lack of activity, kind of similar to what I gave Portland. Next up, the Atlanta Hawks. They did some things. Mostly they re-signed Trae Young. They re-signed John Collins. But my biggest issue here is that their GM literally came out and said that maybe it was a mistake to bring everybody back. There's some issues with John Collins. They just moved Cam Reddish, and that was a very high leverage offseason for Atlanta, coming off of an Eastern Conference Finals appearance. And to re-sign, obviously you're going to re-sign Trae, but to re-sign John Collins and then immediately afterwards say, maybe we shouldn't have brought everybody back, and now there's Collins trade rumors. Maybe he does end up getting moved. I'm going to give them a B- just because obviously it's a good decision to bring back Trae and bring back John Collins in general, but maybe how they did it hasn't gone perfectly. Moving on now to the Houston Rockets. They brought in a ton of rookies, some of which have been fine. I think Şengün's really, really interesting. My biggest issue at the moment is twofold. One, I don't understand the Daniel Tice addition. I don't understand paying him the money that you are. He's a fine player, but paying a big like that, $8 million a year for this year and as well as 3 more years after this, I don't understand that. And then there's Jalen Green, who I think is ultimately going to be fine. But when you see what Evan Mobley's doing in Cleveland, him as well as Cade Cunningham are continually going to be graded against Evan Mobley in Cleveland. And Houston having the opportunity to bring him in, he's certainly been better than Jalen Green to begin this season. Maybe that'll change in the long term, but I'm going to give them a B- for a slight miss in the draft at the moment because that's the only thing I can grade right now. B- for Houston. Next up now, the Denver Nuggets. They drafted Bones Highland, he's interesting. He's someone that's probably going to be a pretty decent scoring guard in the NBA. Hasn't done anything fantastic to begin the season, but he's been fine. And then Jeff Green is a nice little addition for them as a veteran signing. Again, not a ton of activity here for Denver, but I do like the 2 guys that they brought in. I'm going to give them a B-. We move on now to the Indiana Pacers. The biggest move here is that they brought in Chris Duarte in the first round of the draft, the oldest rookie in the draft, and he's been really good. He hasn't been so good lately in terms of his efficiency, certainly compared to the way that he began the season. And yeah, maybe considering where they are now with a possible rebuild, possibly trading Turner or Sabonis, they should have gone for a higher upside player. But I think in terms of value, he's been fine. I'm fine giving them a B grade here. Next up, the Golden State Warriors. They signed some veterans like Porter Jr., Bjelica, Iggy. All of those guys have been fine for them. They've been at least relatively helpful. And then they selected Jonathan Kuminga 7th, as well as Moses Moody later on in the first round. I think Kuminga is going to be really good. I think defensively, there's some crazy upside there. But specifically for this season, I'm looking at that team and I'm wishing Franz Wagner was on it. I think he would have been an awesome fit for them. And seeing how well he's played in Orlando has been really, really fun. That's my biggest negative. It's not that I think Kuminga is going to be bad. It's just for this season in which they have a clear title window. I think Wagner could have helped them more. So I'm going to give them a B. Next up, the Boston Celtics. They got pretty decent value in free agency. They were able to get rid of the Kemba contract, which obviously has been a positive for them. Bring in Josh Richardson, who's been okay. Al Horford's been okay. But in terms of value, in terms of what they did with what they had, I think this is a pretty solid offseason for them. I don't want to punish their offseason just based off how their season has gone so far. I think their issues run way deeper than whatever they did this offseason. And in large part, it was a positive offseason for Boston. I'm going to give them a B. Next up, the Brooklyn Nets. They brought in Cam Thomas, Day'Ron Sharpe, Kessler Edwards. All those guys, especially Thomas, have played decent roles, especially recently. And then the biggest addition they made in free agency was Patty Mills, who's been really good. I've been left wanting a little bit more out of some of the free agency additions, but I'm going to give them a B. Next up, Minnesota, a team that I'm giving a little bit of credit to here because there weren't a ton of moves, but I think Patrick Beverley has helped them from an attitude and an effort standpoint. Rubio, unfortunately, ended up being really good in Cleveland and then got hurt. So you can kind of think about what Rubio would have been like in Minnesota potentially. But I think Beverley has been a nice little addition to them to kind of help this young group. So I'm going to give them a B as well. Next up, the Orlando Magic, a team that I want to give a better grade than this because of how good Franz Wagner has been, how much I like him as a player. But unfortunately, the way that Suggs has played, the 5th overall pick in the draft, really concerns me. He's someone that I loved in the draft process. I thought that just the way that he's played the game the right way. But unfortunately, athletically, I'm not convinced he's going to be able to keep up. I don't know that he's going to be able to get to the rim unless he's a crazy good shot maker. I think it's going to be difficult. I think the absolute maximum ceiling for him, if he can really figure out how to shoot the ball, is like Fred VanVleet. And that's kind of tough out of a guy that I think a lot of people were really excited for. But Wagner's been fantastic, so I can't rate them too negatively for their offseason, so I'm going to give them a B as well. Next up, the Utah Jazz, not a ton to talk about here. They brought back Mike Conley. They brought in Rudy Gay, Hassan Whiteside. Both those veterans have been good for them. Conley's been fine. I'm also going to give them, I promise, the last B of the video. Moving on to the Milwaukee Bucks. Really just some veteran moves here as we start to look at some contenders. George Hill's been fine. Bobby Portis has been fantastic. I think we all knew when they were able to re-sign Bobby Portis to the contract that he was going to be really, really helpful for them. And that has come to fruition so far this season, whether he's needed to be a starter or not in the absence of Brook Lopez. He's been fantastic. I'm going to give them a B+. Next up, Detroit. Of course, the biggest thing for them is they brought in Cade Cunningham, who had a bit of a rocky start to the year. Granted, he was hurt to begin the year. He's really come on lately. I think he's looked fantastic. And they brought in Kelly Olynyk as well. I didn't really understand the signing at the time, but potentially he could be a trade asset this year moving forward. I'm going to give Detroit a B+ just because the Mobley thing is still kind of hovering over them as it relates to Cade, but I'm going to give them a B+. Next up, Oklahoma City, a team that I actually really like what they've done in the draft so far. All 4 of the guys they drafted have played relatively decent roles, even Aaron Wiggins, Robinson Earl, Trey Mann. But the biggest one here is Josh Giddey. And as much as I like Franz Wagner and some of the other guys that came after him in the draft, he's really impressed me lately. I mean, he can get to the rim really, really quickly. He's not crazy fast, but if he gets his shoulders in front of you, he's got long arms, he's got interesting finishes. It just comes down to shot making for him. I think the sky's the limit. He can be a really good defender. He can really play make. He can get to the rim. I think he has all the pieces as long as he works on that jump shot. I really, really like the draft class here for the Thunder. All they needed to do was just continue to stack assets. And so I'm going to tentatively give them a B+, but this is probably closer to an A. Last up, before we get to the A category here, is the Phoenix Suns. They re-signed Chris Paul, who still looks like he's going to be around for a while. And then the other guys that they either re-signed or added to kind of the edges and the fringes of this roster have been good. I'm going to give them a B+. We move on now to the A category, the best of the best from this offseason. Maybe a surprise team here. I have the LA Clippers up here as one of the top offseasons from 2021. They brought back Reggie Jackson, who's been good. They traded for Eric Bledsoe, who's been weirdly good, not crazy efficient offensively, of course, but defensively helps them, gives them another guard they can play. And then some of their rookies, like BJ Boston, have been interesting and have helped them. They're under 500 at the moment, but that's without Kawhi Leonard. That's without Paul George. It's been a difficult year for them from an injury standpoint, but I think they did a lot with a little. I'm going to give the Clippers an A-. Moving on now to the Miami Heat. 2 biggest moves were bringing in PJ Tucker, who's been fine, among other guys, but then trading for Kyle Lowry. And I think when healthy, the moves that they made this offseason make them a legitimate finals contender. If they can get everybody healthy, bam, Jimmy Butler, Kyle Lowry, I think that trio, as well as the other role players they have, make them a legit finals contender. And a lot of that has to do with bringing in Lowry. I'm also going to give them an A-. Moving on now to one of my favorite teams of the season so far, and it's the Memphis Grizzlies. They certainly moved around a lot. They drafted Zaire Williams after moving up to 10th in the draft. They got Steven Adams in exchange for Jonas Valanciunas. They got a future 2022 pick from LA. I think all those are really positive. I'm very, very intrigued by Zaire Williams, whether it be this season or moving forward. Adams fits really, really well with Memphis. I don't really think they've lost much, if anything, there. And I get that extra pick as well. I'm going to give Memphis an A. Moving on to the Toronto Raptors, they moved Kyle Lowry in exchange for Goran Dragic and Precious Achiuwa. I think Precious is ultimately going to be fine. Dragic is someone they could get value out of via trade this season. They re-signed Gary Trent, who's been pretty good. and then it's Scotty Barnes, right? A bit of a surprise selection, picking him ahead of Suggs. He's been awesome. Like, I don't really care what the statistics say on a given night. I love Scotty Barnes. I think he's going to be a really, really good player moving forward. I think he's in a perfect spot in Toronto. I'm going to give them an A as well. And now we have 3 teams left, the 3 best off seasons in the league in 2021. We begin with the Washington Wizards. In the draft, it's been fine. Kisper's been okay. This comes down to the Russ trade. Getting out of that money, how bad Russ has looked in LA. Kuzma's been actually really good. Harrell's been fine. KCP's been fine. Dinwiddie's been okay. Aaron Holiday's been okay. But it really just comes down to getting anything positive out of Russ, I think would have been good. They've gotten a couple of positive pieces. They're in a nice spot here in terms of flexibility moving forward. If they can re-sign Bradley Beal, they can still be a postseason team this year as well. I gave them an A+. And now we have the 2 best off seasons of the league, in my opinion, in 2021. There is no top team. These 2 were tied. You can let me know who you think had the better off season. We begin with Chicago Bulls in no particular order. They're not second. They're just tied for the best. They brought in a ton of guys. Caruso, Lonzo, DeMar's been awesome. DeSumo has been really good as a rookie as well. They get a 2022 first lottery protected from Portland in the Derrick Jones trade as well. Everything is working out incredibly well for Chicago. If they can be healthy and they can continue to play the way that they have, I think they're a legit finals contender. To go from where they were to that in one off season is fantastic. It can't be anything other than an A+. And then we have the Cleveland Cavaliers. The Rubio trade prior to him getting hurt was fantastic for them. Extending Jared Allen has looked really good for them as well. They brought in Lauri Markkanen, who's been an interesting fit, and then it's Evan Mobley. I mean, they didn't really have a choice once he slipped to them at 3. It's not like they made some groundbreaking decision to select Evan Mobley, but he's fantastic. He's awesome. There's so much potential here moving forward for this group. Darius Garland looks awesome. I can't wait to see what Cleveland does moving forward as a result of this 2021 offseason. I gave them an A+ as well. And there you have it. Those are my grades. Let me know down in the comment section below where you would have ranked each of these teams. And yeah, appreciate it, fellas. I'll catch you next time.